All right, philosophy class, welcome here to our recording on ontology, chapter 4 in the Palmer text. In my view, this is the most complicated of the chapters that we have in this text. So bear with me as I discuss this. But I think there are two themes that you can continue to come back to when reviewing this material. And please read the material, but accept that it takes a few times to read through several of the passages in this chapter. But one theme to come back to, are there multiple realities? Are there multiple realities? And secondly, is there a distinction between the mind and the brain? So continue to think of those two as you read through in this chapter and also look at this lecture. Ray Kurzweil wrote a book called The Singularity is Now, arguing in the book that we are now approaching a time in which a computer, which could be converted into a robot, will have the mental capacity of a human being. And when that happens, life as we know it will drastically be altered. We probably are not quite there. We know we're not. But look at the ongoing progression with technology, and we can see how this will have an impact on reality. So what used to fit in a building now fits in your pocket. What fits in your pocket now will fit inside a blood cell in 25 years. So the ongoing question of the use of technology, and then increasingly the question of what is reality. So as we look through this chapter, again, we can come back to the consistency of the categories of reality. Monism, there's one reality. Dualism, two forms of reality. Pluralism, there's multiple realities. In nihilism, there is no reality. All of these are brought out in your text. Most of the emphasis is on monism and dualism. Now, this is a question that we come back to in many cases. I think in many ways it's hard to portray in film. And so in this, one great attempt at doing this is the film Memento, where you have an individual with a serious brain injury in which he has no memory beyond roughly 15 minutes of an experience. And so he ends up taking Polaroids of pictures and remembering them, pasting them on him, tattooing himself, putting memos, on himself, sticky notes to try to remember. But the question is, there's an immediate reality. Is that the only reality? And so, what would your reality be if you had no memory? So is in many ways your reality what you are able to remember. And as we can see when we're looking at personal identity, what makes a person is that person's memory. So what if there is no memory? What then makes that person? So like this chapter, if you haven't watched this film, it's a challenge. And so, but I would urge you to spend some time looking over this film, or at least perhaps going on YouTube and reading some of the reviews about it, watching some of the reviews, gives you a different perspective on what is real. So what we come back to when we're looking at, in many ways, the questions here of reality, one reality is materialism. And that reality is, if you think about Occam's razor from chapter 3, it's the most straightforward. There's one reality. And the reality is material in nature, the physical. So, and one way of considering that is that the minds are brains. So have you ever considered when someone says, this is in my mind, but what is your mind? Where is it? And is that, because people don't say, well, I have this kicking around in my brain. Maybe they do, but by and large, they're thinking of their mind. That's a separate entity than the brain. But with materialism, that's not the case. There is no separation between mind and brain. And that leaves us with a really good issue there. Is there actually a separation between the mind and the brain? British philosopher, English philosopher, be more specific, Thomas Hobbes from the 1600s would argue that there wasn't. It's just strict materialism. So how do you explain something like a dream, which we all experience? To him, it would be like having another version of a muscle spasm. In this case, it's a brain spasm. So do you view your brain as an organ, just like a stomach? And in that case, it has different kinds of reactions, but you don't view it separately. And so a dream is just a spasm of the brain, according to Hobbes. This strict materialist view on page 120 breaks down into different categories of behaviorism. If you've had psychology, gone into this particular topic. And again, one extreme, only bodies in motion. There is not really thinking going on. Or if it is, again, it's just a form of reaction, just like there would be with someone's arm or leg. And so that would be, of course, a very strict version of behaviorism. Then you have a question of soft behaviorism. Well, maybe the mind does exist, but we can't really verify it. There is no way to document that a mind does exist. And then ultimately, all that we have are observations. Everything is based on observance, as we can see here, logical behaviorism. And in your text, roughly around page 120, there is an interesting question. In what way do you conclude that someone intended a certain outcome from an activity? And then you're now starting to interpret someone's mind. Is that really worthwhile? We have the observance of the activity. Why that person did it is probably not that worthwhile. We just know that it happened, and that's the observation. So to spend time then thinking about the intent is not a worthy contribution. With this then can also be the question, can people be manipulated and changed? So if you're trying to get a particular body in motion, if you're trying to get a particular outcome, can that outcome be done based on the changes of behavior, either rewards or punishments? And that's how people are going to react, not based on their mind and their decision-making process, according to behaviorism. Can we essentially break down a human being that way, that we're in some ways lumps of clay that can be shaped? Behaviorism would argue that we can. So here we have the big debate in a really challenging part of the text to read from pages 128 to 132. Be sure to read through this and spend some time on this. The mental state is brain state. Is it? Is there a separation between the mental state and the brain state? Or are they the same? And this is going to be the challenge that you see in large part on these pages. So one side of that fence would be, no, the functionalism, and that the brain and the mind is a system. So it's not something separate that makes us really unique individuals. And that's, of course, a big part of where we're coming from on all this, where we're ultimately going, I should say, right? To say, are we looking at ways in which we can become unique individuals through the use of our minds. But if the mind is really not separate or unique, then that wouldn't be the case. The mind is not a thing but a system. Any computational system capable of manipulating symbols to solve problems is said to have mental states. Well, that would be our brain, but that would also be a computer. So is there not really a distinction? Are we just fleshy computers? And so how do we then say we're something different than that? Well, there's challenges then to functionalism. So in a way, we see this throughout the text, but especially in this chapter, it's very important to look at that. A proposal is made, then there's either an adaptation to that proposal or a pushback to that proposal. So we can see some pushback to functionalism. And part of that is what's referred to as Nagel's bat. A couple of good thought experiments that are brought out here that are also found in the what if text. But you read about this in the Palmer text on pages 138 to 139. What is it like to be a bat? Anytime that we're really talking about what it's like to be a bat, we're really describing our version of what it's like to be a bat. So the question that Nagel raises is, what is it like for a bat to be a bat? And this is a case where, can we really answer that? Ultimately, we can conclude that we can't. So we don't really know that. So did we really then know what it's like to be a human if you're not a human? Is there always going to be some distinction of what it is to be a human compared to any other device that may do similar human things, but is still not a human? Now, we can also then expand on this thought experiment to say, do we know what it's like to be another person? This is where I think this becomes an important thought experiment as well, to look at the issue of empathy. I'm not really sure if Nagel was intending that to happen, but could a person of one color understand what it's like to be a person of a different color? Could a person of one gender understand what it's like to be a person of another gender? Even to go beyond that, could a person of one economic status know what it's like to be a person of a different economic status? So here we can see that this thought experiment has many different areas of contribution that can be made here. Look that over, Nagel's bat, 138, 139. And so what's it like to be a human? Is it really just receiving stimuli and processing the stimuli? Is that it? If it is, then a brain in the vat can work. Now, this is from the what if text as well as in your text. So it's been introduced to in the Palmer text. So it's been introduced to us in the Palmer text. You can go though to page 62 in the what if text and read in greater detail about the thought experiment. But we've had some discussion about that here. So again, what is it like to be a human? If in fact to be a human is to process stimuli, then a brain in the vat can suffice. But is there more to that? Is there more to being a human than that? And that becomes then a challenge to this thought experiment, something for us to think over for sure. Well, maybe Descartes in a way can rescue us from this whole debate and to bring up the issue of dualism. And so in this case, we can have this separation, that there is a body, that the body then is really in some ways, although it's shaped differently, that's not what makes a human different than another physical thing, because they have bodies too. And so all of that would be part of what makes a body. And to that degree, you can also have a body and a non-living thing. But what makes the distinction then, according to Descartes, is that we think. And again, if you go back to some of the writings there of Descartes that we've talked about in previous chapters, the thinking is clarified because we doubt. And so therefore, that means that we think. And it has to be that to exist, you must think. You could exist even without the body, but you couldn't exist without the mind. The mind is what makes the human distinctive and makes existence real. So that then becomes very important. Again, I would say a challenge for Cartian metaphysics would be the issue of, are humans the only thing which thinks, and however way you make that distinction. But even there, when we're going at dualism, when we're going with dualism and thinking about it and saying maybe this is our answer to this question about how many realities there are, that you can come back and say, well, which one has the greater authority? Is it the mind or the body? Are there particular instances in which one has more authority than the other? And that's not entirely defined. So perhaps when we're kind of stuck in this mire and trying to figure out what reality we're in, is that we could, in these pages of the text, as a way of solving this problem, we can consistently turn to better communication. That communication would be created by turning to scientific communication. There's a universality behind scientific communication, and it is a way then of understanding that common reality. So to eliminate subjective thought, this is what creates our questions about what is real, because we have subjective thought, individual modes of expression, individual uses of the mind, and unproven thought. And so the way to solve that is to have better communication. So you'll see in these pages that, well, many of us today would not, when we have a thunderstorm, say Thor hammers in the heavens. That's not what we're going to say. We'd probably say, well, there's a thunderstorm. We probably wouldn't come up with a more scientific answer than that. But many of us will say the sun sets in the west and not really think about that. That too is not accurate, but that's what we say. And it is subjective. That's what we see, but that's not a scientific explanation of what's happened. So if we turn more to the scientific explanations, we'll all be on the same page and we'll all have the same reality. That's the goal in this case. Science, as you'll see in these pages, provides the answer. So we have the philosopher Richard Rorty, who would say there are better ways than to explain a phenomenon by using science. Again, eliminate subjective communication. I am in pain, according to Rorty, is a subjective statement. But, when is it in pain? It's pain because I have some nerve that's being stimulated, or I'm in pain because my favorite team lost a key game. I'm in pain because I read a sad novel. So, what does that mean? And so in this case, let's be more specific. And that's where you turn to something like, we're not using this, are we? But my C fibers are stimulated. If we started to talk that way, we would all understand what that language meant. It's a way of unifying us to one reality. So we're consistently now in this challenge. This is a challenge for many of you. You have a 40-year difference than me in this class. And so the experiences that you're going to have, the challenges that you're going to have in the next 40 years that I may not have, are going to be in large part dealing with this area. How strong and important is the computer? How separate are humans from the computer? Or is this really just another form of artificial intelligence that's happening with the human being? So we accept that the brain is a computer. So there's our challenge. And I think, again, will continue to be a challenge. Is the brain, and as a consequence, the human being, more than that? It's more than a computer. It's more than a robot. And on page 134, you see some argument there, a strong argument that it is more, that just processing information is not enough. So on page 134, you'll see another thought experiment, the Chinese room argument by John Searle. So in this thought experiment, someone could be sitting in a room and get a request for a Chinese symbol. And we probably all know about the Chinese symbols meaning different things. And the individual in that room now gets the request for a symbol. Let's say the symbol is supposed to be a cup. Well, then they look up in some book what is the Chinese symbol for a cup, and they draw out that Chinese symbol, and on the other side of the room, they pass out a card that gives them that sign. Now, I suppose the individual who's now made the request can say something inside that room knows Chinese. But did that person really know Chinese? The person looked at the request, turned to a book, found the answer, and gave the answer. Was it just really processing information? So the argument there is that that's what a computer might do, but a human does more than that. And it's not the same than what human beings would do. So the moral of the story, as you look through that part, computers are developed for rule-following procedures. Minds deal with meanings. That's our distinction. Computers don't deal with meanings. Therefore, computers are not minds. There is going to be a distinction. There's an interesting challenge, though. And again, I would think a challenge that's going to be with us for many years to come. Is the human better? Perhaps we've really, throughout the history of human beings, we haven't really had to answer that question, but perhaps increasingly we are. Is there a reason to use the human over the machine? So if the machine is less likely to break down, there's a consistency to the output from the machine that there isn't from the human, then there may be some reason to actually raise that question. But there may still be occupations and jobs in which we would say the human should be better. There's a reason to think that way. Like in this picture, the kindergarten teacher. So even if we have now developed a robot, we, the human being, that can read faces, process information, make responses, and make an analysis on what is the most immediate thing to do for the kindergartner, the student, is there still a way of saying that the human is better? So we've got minds and robots don't. If we can make that conclusion that there is something separate from the brain called the mind, the human has a mind, the robot does not have a mind. So how does the human kindergarten teacher react differently than the robot kindergarten teacher? For example, something like helping Johnny with his yellow Play-Doh can. Maybe Johnny has for some reason, a problem and opening up that can and using the Play-Doh properly. What way could the human kindergarten teacher do a better job responding than the robot kindergarten teacher? Well, answer that there on chat and see if we can come up with a way to defend the human being over a really skilled robot. Okay, so there we are looking at some of the issues involving ontology, what is real, chapter 4 in the Palmer text. We'll go into some more detail about that philosopher that I mentioned in this recording, Thomas Hobbes, in our next recording.